The airport hums with impatience. People rush past each other, eyes glued to their phones, dragging suitcases, shuffling through security. No one spares a second glance at the mother standing in line with her son. Her hand is wrapped around his, firm, steady, anchoring him to the ground. His other hand clutches a game console, fingers pressing the buttons in a rhythmic pattern. Tap, tap, tap. It's his way of keeping the world from swallowing him whole. She knows what's coming. The looks, the whispers, the judgment. It always happens. A few feet away, a man in an expensive suit sighs dramatically, adjusting the strap of his designer bag. His watch gleams under the artificial lights. He checks the time, then looks at the boy with barely concealed irritation. The child rocks slightly, overwhelmed by the chaos around him. His breathing is uneven. Too many sounds. Too many lights. Too many people. His fingers press the buttons faster. Tap, tap, tap. His mother kneels beside him, voice gentle. Mac, sweetheart, look at me. The suited man's frown deepens. He exhales sharply, rolling his eyes. To him, this is a delay, an inconvenience, a disruption in his perfectly planned schedule. What he doesn't know is that in just a few hours, the very woman he's looking down on will hold his future in her hands. Some lessons in life come easy. Others cost everything. If you believe kindness matters, hit subscribe now. Life has a way of exposing people for who they really are. Sometimes it happens in the smallest moments when no one is watching. Other times, it happens when the world is listening. And today, at 30,000 feet, three strangers will collide in a way none of them expected. One will show grace. One will fight through fear. And one will reveal just how little he thinks of others. Phoebe Sharp doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. At 36, she's built a career handling numbers that most people will never see in their lifetime. As the chief financial officer of a leading investment firm, she negotiates deals worth millions, advises executives twice her age, and walks into boardrooms where every decision has weight. But today, none of that matters. Today, she isn't a CFO. She isn't a powerhouse in the business world. She's just a mother. A mother traveling with her 9-year-old son. A mother who understands that even the simplest things, waiting in line, finding a seat, getting through the flight, are not simple for him. She keeps her voice steady, her movements calm. She's dressed in quiet elegance. A silk blouse, tailored pants, hair swept back in a loose bun. Understated. Composed. Not because she cares what people think, but because she has learned that blending in is sometimes easier than standing out. But no matter how composed she looks, she's always aware of the weight in her chest. The silent battle she fights every time they step into a crowded place. She grips her son's hand, not too tight, just enough to remind him that she's there, that he's safe. She hears the impatient sigh from the man behind her. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't react. She's had years of practice ignoring the judgment of strangers. But her son hasn't. Mac knows his mother is trying to help him. He feels the warmth of her hand around his. He hears her soft words, the way she reminds him to breathe. He knows she understands him, but it's still too much. The airport is too loud. The lights are too bright. The voices, the footsteps, the sounds of luggage rolling across the floor, it all crashes together in a way that makes his chest feel tight. His fingers press the buttons of his game console, faster and faster. Tap, tap, tap. It's the only thing that makes sense right now. The rhythm keeps him steady. The familiar sound helps drown out everything else. He hears the man behind them sigh again. Loud. Annoyed. The kind of sound that people make when they think something is wrong with him. He's heard it before. At grocery stores. In restaurants. At school. People don't say it out loud, but he can feel it. Why can't he just act normal? His mother kneels beside him, her voice low and calm. Mac, sweetheart, look at me. He tries. He really does. But it's hard when the world won't slow down. Royce Ramos doesn't wait for people. People wait for him. He built his career on control, multi-million-dollar deals, high-stakes investments, decisions that shape industries. He's the kind of man who walks into a room and expects doors to open for him. He's earned it. And right now, he's wasting his time standing behind a mother who can't seem to control her kid. He checks his watch. The flight leaves in an hour. His meeting in New York is too important to miss. He needs everything to go smoothly. But of course, there's always someone slowing things down. The kid keeps tapping on his game console. The sound is irritating. Click, click, click. Royce exhales sharply. He knows what's coming. The mother will turn around, apologize for the noise, ask for patience. And then she'll expect the rest of the world to adjust to them. He's seen it before. People who expect special treatment. People who think their problems are everyone else's responsibility. He folds his arms, staring straight ahead. He doesn't say anything. Not yet. But when the time comes, he won't hold back. Because in his mind, respect isn't given. It's earned. What he doesn't know is that, before the day is over, he will lose everything because of the way he sees the world. In every story, there are those who bring kindness, those who uphold order, and those who hold the power to change everything. On this flight, each of them will play a role. Some will extend grace. Some will try to keep the peace. And some will unknowingly hold the fate of another in their hands. Not everyone turns away when they see someone struggling. Some people step up. Lyra Franklin has always been one of those people. It's why she became a teacher. Because she believes in meeting people where they are, and making things just a little easier for those who need it. She watches the mother and son ahead of her in line. She doesn't know them, but she can tell the woman is holding everything together with quiet strength. She sees the way the boy grips his game console, his shoulders tight with anxiety. She's seen this before. She works with children like him every day. She knows how the world treats them, how some people roll their eyes, how others act like they're just a nuisance. And she knows how much a small act of kindness can mean. So when she hears the mother ask a man to switch seats, she's already decided what she's going to do. The man refuses, his voice clipped, dismissive. Lyra doesn't hesitate. You can have mine. The mother looks at her, surprised. Really? Lyra just nods. Of course. She doesn't do it for praise. She doesn't expect a thank you. She does it because it's the right thing to do. And because she knows that, sometimes, the smallest kindness can change everything. Alice Barber has worked as a flight attendant long enough to know that flights don't just carry passengers. They carry tensions, frustrations, and egos. She's seen grown adults fight over armrests. She's broken up arguments about overhead bins. She's had to smile through insults thrown her way when people didn't get what they wanted. But she also knows how to read a situation. And the moment she steps onto this flight, she can already tell which passengers are going to be difficult. She notices the mother and son right away. She sees the boy's hands moving rapidly over his game console, his head slightly down. She recognizes the signs: overstimulation, anxiety. She also notices the businessman. The stiff posture, the restless sighs, the way he taps his fingers impatiently against the tray table. Alice knows how this is going to go. She's seen it too many times before. Her job is to keep things running smoothly. To make sure no one disrupts the flight. To be polite, even when people are rude. But what happens on this plane will test that patience. Because keeping the peace only works when people want peace. And some people, like Royce Ramos, only care about themselves. Some men don't need to raise their voices to command respect. Simon Walter is one of them. He built his career on strategy and instinct. He's the kind of CEO who doesn't just crunch numbers, he reads people. And that's why he's been so successful. Because he knows that business isn't just about money. It's about trust. But beyond the boardroom, beyond the deals and contracts, Simon is a husband first. A father before anything else. And right now, that's the only thing on his mind. Because today isn't just another meeting. Today is the day his wife and son are supposed to be coming home. And when he finds out they missed their flight, not because of weather, not because of an airline mistake, but because of someone else's cruelty, something shifts. He listens as his wife tells him what happened. How a stranger treated their son like a problem. How a man refused to give up his seat, then complained when Mac needed comfort. And as he listens, a thought settles in his mind. Some people think power means getting what you want at any cost. But real power? It's choosing who deserves to stand beside you. And before this day is over, Simon will make that choice. Bowden Calhoun, the investor who sees everything Bowden Calhoun didn't get to where he is by ignoring red flags. He's an investor, a risk assessor, a man who doesn't just look at numbers, but at the people behind them. Royce Ramos has been trying to impress him for months, pushing for a deal that could change everything. On paper, Royce has the experience, the skills, the connections. But Bowden doesn't trust numbers alone. He trusts character. And as he watches Simon Walter shift in his seat, staring down at his phone with an expression that's hard to read, Bowden knows something is about to happen. When Simon finally speaks, the room stills. He doesn't yell. He doesn't rage. He simply lays out the facts. His wife. His son. A man who showed his true nature when he thought no one important was watching. And just like that, the deal Royce was counting on is slipping away. Bowden watches it all. And in that moment, he knows. He made the right call. People say you really get to know someone by how they treat others when they think no one important is watching. That moment was about to happen. The plane was boarding, passengers filing in, some moving quickly, others taking their time as they settled into their seats. The hum of conversation mixed with the mechanical clatter of luggage compartments slamming shut. For most, this was just another flight. A few hours in the air, a minor inconvenience at worst. For Phoebe Sharp, it was something entirely different. She guided Mac down the narrow aisle, keeping one hand on his shoulder. He was doing his best, but she could feel the tension in him. His grip on his game console was tight, his fingers pressing the buttons in a steady, rhythmic tap. It was how he coped, how he blocked out the overwhelming noise, the movement, the shifting of people too close, too loud, too unpredictable. She glanced at their assigned seats. Mac had the window. That wouldn't work. She knew how he would react. The feeling of being boxed in, unable to move freely, would unsettle him. It would start as discomfort, then turn into panic. She turned to the man already seated in the aisle seat. He hadn't acknowledged them, too focused on his phone. His suit was crisp, his cufflinks gleaming under the cabin lights. Royce Ramos. Phoebe cleared her throat gently. "Excuse me. Would you mind switching seats so my son could have the aisle? He gets anxious sitting by the window." Royce finally looked up, his brows furrowed slightly, as if she'd just interrupted something far more important than a simple conversation. "Are you joking?" His tone was dry, laced with disbelief. "I paid for this seat. If you needed an aisle seat, you should have planned better." Phoebe held his gaze. She had handled multi-million-dollar negotiations, had spoken in rooms full of men just like him. Powerful, arrogant, dismissive. She could argue her case, but she could already see it in his face. He wasn't going to move. Before she could respond, another voice entered the conversation. "I can switch with you." Phoebe turned, meeting the warm, understanding eyes of Lyra Franklin. Lyra was already halfway out of her seat, gathering her bag. "You can take mine," she said easily. "I understand how important it is for kids to feel safe." Phoebe hesitated. "Are you sure?" Lyra nodded. Of course. She didn't need an explanation. Didn't ask why it mattered. She simply saw a child who needed help and acted. It was a small act of kindness, but Phoebe knew how much it meant. She turned to Royce, hoping he would at least acknowledge the solution. But instead, he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "People like you always expect handouts." Phoebe stiffened. She could say something. She could tell him exactly what she thought of men like him, those who measured people's worth by convenience. But she didn't, because right now, Mac was the priority. She simply thanked Lyra, helped her son into his seat, and buckled in beside him. Maybe now, the flight would go smoothly. She should have known better. The final passengers boarded. The last of the overhead bins clicked shut. The pre-flight announcements droned over the speakers. Mac clutched his game console, pressing the buttons in a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was working. His breathing was even. His body was still. He was handling it. And then, a sharp voice cut through the cabin. "Does he have to have the volume on full blast? I don't want to listen to that racket for 3 hours." Phoebe turned, already knowing who it was. Royce was glaring at them, his lips pressed in irritation. She inhaled slowly, keeping her voice level. The sound helps him focus. It keeps him calm. Royce scoffed, shaking his head. "That's not my problem. Your kid shouldn't make his problems everyone else's." Phoebe felt the weight of the moment settle between them. And before she could even decide what to say, another voice spoke up. Alice Barber, the flight attendant. Her expression was polite, professional, but there was a firmness in her voice. "Sir, please be patient. This is a full flight." Royce let out an exaggerated sigh, rubbing his temples like he was the one being inconvenienced. Phoebe reached over and placed a hand on Mac's, gently pressing it. A silent message. "You're okay. I've got you." But she knew the truth. This wasn't over. Because people like Royce never let things go. The first hour of the flight passed without further conflict, but Phoebe knew it was only a matter of time. She could feel Mac growing uneasy. His small movements became more restless. His fingers drummed against his console a little faster. His shoulders stiffened. The game had helped, but it wasn't enough anymore. The hum of the plane, the chatter of passengers, the occasional ding of the seatbelt sign, it was too much. She leaned toward him, her voice low and soothing. "Mac is strong. Mac is brave. Mac faces challenges, but he doesn't cave." It was a simple mantra. Something she had started when he was younger, during doctor's visits, thunderstorms, crowded spaces. It was familiar, safe, a reminder that he could get through this. She saw the tension ease slightly in his face. Then a loud, dramatic sigh. Royce threw his head back against the seat rest, his voice laced with exasperation. I can't sit here if she's going to sing the entire flight. Can you make her stop? The words cut through the moment like a knife. Mac flinched. Phoebe's jaw tightened. She turned to Royce, her voice calm but firm. I'm just trying to keep my son comfortable. Royce let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. And I'm just trying to get through my flight without listening to a lullaby recital. Some of us have real responsibilities. Before Phoebe could respond, Alice Barber appeared again, standing at the edge of the row. Her smile was polite, her posture professional, but there was something sharper in her eyes. Sir, if you're uncomfortable, you're welcome to use the noise-canceling headphones provided in the seat back pocket. Royce scoffed. That's not the point. Alice didn't flinch. Then what is? For once, Royce had no response. He waved a hand dismissively and turned toward the window, muttering something under his breath. Phoebe exhaled slowly. She turned back to Mac, who had curled slightly into himself, staring down at his hands. She wanted to tell him that people like Royce didn't matter, that they didn't deserve his worry. But she knew that wasn't how the world worked. And before she could find the right words, another problem hit. Max suddenly tensed, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Phoebe immediately knew something was wrong. What is it, sweetheart? She asked softly. Mac's fingers gripped the hem of his shirt. My lunchbox. It's not here. Her stomach dropped. She knew how much it meant to him. It wasn't just about food. His routine, his comfort, it was all tied to that familiar container. The one he had picked out himself. The one that made him feel safe. Phoebe closed her eyes briefly. She had placed it on the seat beside her at the gate. In the rush to board, it must have been left behind. She turned to Alice. I need to step off the plane to grab my son's lunchbox. It's right at the gate. Alice hesitated, her professionalism flickering with sympathy. We're about to close the doors. Phoebe nodded. I know. I'll be quick. Alice glanced toward the front of the cabin. I can ask the captain, but, she hesitated. The other passengers will have to agree. If even one objects, we can't delay departure. Phoebe turned to the rest of the plane. Some passengers looked confused, others indifferent. She swallowed hard. Please. It's right at the gate. I just need 30 seconds. Silence. Then, Royce's voice, sharp and full of disbelief. Absolutely not. I have $1 million deal in New York, and I won't be late because of her special privileges. His voice carried, loud enough that heads turned. The air in the cabin seemed to tighten. Phoebe's hands curled into fists against her lap. It's not a privilege. It's my son's medical need. Royce let out a bitter chuckle. Give me a break. The rest of us had to plan ahead. Why should she get special treatment? Mac had shrunk back in his seat, his breathing uneven. Alice raised a hand. Sir, the decision has to be unanimous. Let's allow the passengers to vote. Phoebe looked around. No one said a word. She could see the hesitation on their faces. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply averted their eyes, not wanting to get involved. Silence felt like a verdict, and Royce's disapproving gaze sealed it. Phoebe felt something heavy settle in her chest. She knew what she had to do. She reached for Mac's hand. His little fingers curled into hers. Without a word, she unbuckled their seatbelts. Slowly, carefully, she gathered their bags. Lyra, watching the entire scene unfold, shook her head. She murmured under her breath, just loud enough for Phoebe to hear. Some people have no humanity. Phoebe didn't look back. She just held Mac's hand a little tighter and stepped off the plane. The plane took off without them. Phoebe and Mac sat in the quiet of the terminal, watching it disappear into the sky. Mac clutched his game console but wasn't playing. His fingers barely moved. Phoebe placed an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. She already knew. It wasn't just about missing a flight. It was about how they missed it. About the silence of the other passengers. About the weight of being treated as an inconvenience. She wouldn't cry. Not here. She just exhaled, reached for her phone, and did what she always did, figured out the next step. A few states away, in a sleek Manhattan skyscraper, Simon Walters sat at the head of an elegant dining table. The private business luncheon was everything it was supposed to be: polished, exclusive, filled with the quiet hum of wealth and power. Bowden Calhoun, one of the most respected investors in the industry, swirled his drink in one hand, nodding as he spoke. I have to say, this partnership looks like a solid move. A lot of potential for long-term growth, he said. Across from him, Royce Ramos leaned back in his chair, smug. He had worked hard for this moment, convincing Bowden that his company was the right choice. That he was the right choice. He had dressed for success, another sharp suit, another expensive watch, another air of confidence that made him feel untouchable. Royce had already counted this deal as a victory. Simon, seated just a few feet away, smiled politely, but his attention was somewhere else. He glanced at his phone, checking the time. Bowden noticed. Everything all right, Simon? Simon nodded, still smiling. Yeah, I was just looking forward to my wife and son coming home today. He set his phone down, his fingers resting on the screen for a beat too long. His voice was light, casual. But they missed their flight. Royce barely looked up from his drink. He had no reason to care. Simon continued. Apparently, some rude passenger refused to help my wife and made the airline leave them behind. Royce chuckled. Some people just don't plan properly. The words left his mouth easily. A throwaway comment. Simon finally looked at him. And this time, his expression changed. You're right, Simon said, his voice softer. Some people don't plan properly. And Royce had no idea that he had just walked straight into the worst mistake of his career. The deal was nearly done. The contracts had been reviewed, the terms agreed upon. The meeting had gone exactly as Royce Ramos had planned. Or so he thought. Bowden Calhoun was impressed. Royce could tell. The investor had praised his company's projections, acknowledged the market dominance they were aiming for. This deal wasn't just another partnership. It was the kind of contract that could elevate Royce's name in the business world. Sitting across from him, Simon Walter still had that same polite, professional smile. The one that never revealed too much. But something about him had changed. There was a distance now, a quiet calculation in the way he listened rather than spoke. Royce noticed, but dismissed it. He had this in the bag. Then Simon's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and immediately softened. His entire demeanor shifted, the sharp businessman replaced by something warmer. A husband. A father. He answered with a smile. Hey, sweetheart. The screen lit up with Phoebe's face. Hi, honey, she said, her voice carrying a quiet exhaustion. I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday. Royce's stomach twisted. Simon beamed, completely unaware of the tension now sitting across the table. I can't wait to have you and Mac back home. Royce's grip tightened on his drink. His heartbeat kicked up. His throat went dry. He had spent the entire flight ignoring Phoebe Sharp, dismissing her, insulting her. And now, in real time, he was watching his carefully crafted world unravel. Simon glanced up mid-conversation and frowned. Royce, you look like you've seen a ghost. Royce forced a smile, but his face had lost all color. Phoebe, unaware of what was happening on the other end, continued. Oh, by the way, she said casually, shaking her head. I met the most awful man on the plane. Royce shifted in his chair. Simon's gaze flicked toward him. The room felt smaller. He wouldn't give up his seat for Mac, Phoebe continued. Insulted me, acted like we were a burden. And when I needed to step off the plane to grab Mac's lunchbox, he threw a tantrum and refused to let them hold the flight. That's why we missed it. The air in the room changed. Simon leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. His voice was even. Calm. Too calm. Phoebe, he said slowly. I think you just described my current business partner. The silence was deafening. Royce stuttered, his hands gripping the edge of the table. It was just a misunderstanding. Simon's expression hardened. A misunderstanding? His voice was still quiet, but there was no warmth left. You humiliated my wife and son, Simon continued, his tone like steel. You acted like they were beneath you. Royce opened his mouth to protest, but Simon wasn't finished. If this is how you treat people when you think no one important is watching, Simon said coldly, why should I trust you to do business with integrity? Bowden frowned, setting his glass down. He had been listening closely, and now, his eyes flickered with disapproval. This is the kind of man we're backing? Bowden asked, his voice sharp. Royce swallowed hard. It's not. This isn't. Simon pushed his chair back and stood. I can't, in good conscience, sign this deal. Royce felt the world shift under him. His breath hitched. He had been moments away from securing a multi-million-dollar contract. It was gone, just like that. But, Royce started, his voice desperate. Simon barely looked at him. He reached for his wallet, pulled out a credit card, and placed it on the table. You're free to pick up the bill, though. The final blow landed with quiet devastation. Royce could only watch as his career, his reputation, his entire future slipped away, all because of a decision he had made hours ago on a plane. Royce sat frozen. The weight of the moment crashed down on him. The reality that this wasn't just an awkward misunderstanding, it was a permanent stain on his reputation. He had spent years building his career, shaping his image as a power player in the industry. But all it took was one flight, one moment of arrogance, one refusal to show basic decency, and it all slipped away. Simon walked out of the restaurant, his shoulders relaxed, his conscience clear. He had lost nothing. But Royce? He had lost everything. The other executives slowly stood, murmuring among themselves. Bowden gave Royce one last disapproving glance before following Simon. The decision was final. The deal was dead. And now, Royce Ramos, the man who once thought kindness was weakness, was completely alone. Respect is free. But sometimes, disrespect comes at $1 million price. Then, Phoebe's voice steady, calm, but carrying the weight of a lesson learned too late. The way you treat people when you think no one's watching says everything about you. The scene fades, leaving only one lingering question. If you believe in kindness and respect, subscribe now. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done in this situation?